In a serene suburban neighborhood where every lawn was impeccably manicured and each mailbox stood in perfect alignment, Dylan quickly became the unmistakable anomaly. A free-spirited young professional with an unconventional outlook, Dylan had recently inherited a modest parcel of land from his late relative. In stark contrast to the neighborhood's obsession with symmetry and order, his property boasted a riot of wildflowers, deliberately cultivated to attract bees, butterflies, and other pollinators. Dylan's relaxed attitude clashed vividly with the community's rigid expectations, a conflict embodied by his new neighbor, Melissa. Self-appointed as the guardian of proper conduct, Melissa was never without her clipboard and a permanently disapproving expression, ever ready to ensure that every aspect of the neighborhood conformed to her strict vision of perfection. From the moment Dylan settled in, Melissa appeared to single him out. It began with her decrying his wildflower displays as an unruly weed invasion and escalated to condemning the color of his mailbox as an aesthetic abomination. It was almost as if Dylan's very presence defied her standards. In one memorable incident, while Dylan was leisurely sipping his coffee on the porch and enjoying the chorus of chirping birds, a police vehicle rolled up. An officer cautiously approached him, and when Dylan inquired, "What's happening, officer?" the response was hesitant. "We received a call about a hazardous structure on your property." Confused, Dylan glanced over at his charming garden shed, and suddenly the realization struck. Melissa had dialed 911 on him. As the officer inspected the shed, Melissa emerged with a smug air, proclaiming, "I told you, this landowner refuses to follow neighborhood standards. That shed is a safety hazard." Dylan couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. It soon became clear that Melissa's actions were not isolated incidents, but the beginning of a deliberate campaign to make Dylan's life unbearable. Initially, she resorted to posting handwritten notes on his door, decrying his yard as an unsightly eyesore that was allegedly lowering property values. At first, Dylan found these notes amusing, so much so that he even pinned them to his refrigerator as quirky tokens of his unconventional charm. However, Melissa's passive-aggressive tactics soon escalated into overt actions. The first major confrontation occurred during a relaxed barbecue that Dylan hosted for a few friends. A simple affair with grilled burgers, soft tunes, and friendly laughter. Just as the burgers were coming off the grill, the flashing lights of a police car appeared in the driveway. Perplexed, Dylan approached the officer, who explained, "We received a noise complaint." Meanwhile, Melissa stood on the sidewalk, arms folded and lips pursed, accusing him, "They've been blasting music and disturbing the peace for hours." Although the background music was scarcely audible, the officer quickly dismissed the complaint, leaving behind only Melissa's self-satisfied smirk. Her behavior grew even more preposterous as days passed. Melissa filed a complaint with the city, insisting that Dylan's vibrant wildflower garden was a magnet for pests and demanded its removal. When a city inspector eventually arrived, they confirmed that the garden not only complied with all local regulations, but also provided environmental benefits. Frustrated by her failure, Melissa began to scrutinize every inch of Dylan's property. One morning, he awoke to find her on the sidewalk, armed with a tape measure as she meticulously documented the height of his grass. Then there were the Halloween decorations. Dylan, a devoted fan of the spooky season, had gone all out with pumpkins, skeletons, and even a modest fog machine. While the neighborhood children adored his festive display, Melissa was incensed. Storming over, she pointed at the decorations as if they were evidence of a crime scene and declared, "These pumpkins are not regulation size, and that fog machine poses a serious fire hazard." When Dylan refused to remove them, she once again resorted to dialing 911. The absurdity of Melissa's actions soon caught the attention of other residents. Although she had attempted to impose her strict rules on several neighbors in the past, Dylan had become her primary target. With each police call, every city complaint, and constant harassment, Dylan's initial amusement faded, replaced by a firm resolve to stand up for himself. At first, Dylan attempted to ignore Melissa's increasingly ludicrous complaints and simply enjoy his new home. However, when she phoned 911 for the third time in a single month, this time alleging that his outdoor string lights were blinding her at night, he decided that enough was enough. Recognizing that Melissa was not merely an annoying presence, but an active force intent on making his life miserable, he began to fight back with humor. His first act of defiance was to assemble an army of lawn gnomes, each sporting miniature signs emblazoned with messages such as "Melissa's Kingdom," "Beware of grass violations," and "No fun allowed." The neighborhood children found the gnome display hilarious, and even several residents couldn't help but smile as they passed by, though Melissa was far from amused. Fuming, she marched up to Dylan's yard and declared, "This is harassment." Leaning casually against his porch railing, Dylan replied with a wry smile, "I'm just expressing my creativity. Isn't that allowed?" And the gnomes were only the beginning. When Melissa once again complained about his wildflower garden, Dylan decided to elaborate on his display. He installed small plaques identifying each type of flower, complete with educational tidbits on their environmental benefits. In a further twist of irony, he renamed his garden the Melissa Memorial Pollinator Sanctuary and shared it on social media, where it quickly won favor with friends and neighbors. Melissa's attempts to depict Dylan as a troublemaker began to backfire spectacularly. Melissa, undeterred, escalated her campaign by circulating a petition aimed at having Dylan removed from the neighborhood, claiming that he was a disruptive influence. When Dylan learned of the petition, he decided to address the issue directly by going door to door, not to defend himself, but to listen to his neighbors and understand their perspectives. To his surprise, many admitted that they had long suffered under Melissa's overbearing rule. Some had even been targets of her harassment for years, but had felt too intimidated to challenge her. Dylan's calm demeanor and sense of humor eventually inspired them to speak out. Meanwhile, Melissa intensified her efforts by filing yet another complaint with the city, this time insisting that Dylan's garden fence was a safety hazard. However, Dylan had already researched the local property codes and ensured that every feature of his land was in strict compliance. The city inspector found no issues, and once again, Melissa's credibility suffered a severe blow. The situation reached a climax when Melissa attempted to accuse Dylan of hosting illegal gatherings in his backyard. During one of his casual get-togethers with a few neighbors, she called the police, alleging that a raucous party was disturbing the peace. But this time, Dylan was prepared. Weeks earlier, he had installed security cameras, and when the police arrived, he presented them with footage of the quiet, friendly gathering, even capturing Melissa herself, stealthily spying from her window. The officers, clearly exasperated by her antics, issued her a formal warning for making false reports. What had begun as a personal dispute had now transformed into a broader symbol of resistance against Melissa's petty authoritarianism. Other residents, once too fearful or indifferent, began to rally around Dylan. Robert, a retired engineer living next door, offered his technical expertise by providing old HOA meeting notes that directly contradicted many of Melissa's self-imposed rules. Eleanor, an elderly widow known for her delectable cookies and gentle demeanor, recounted how Melissa had once tried to force her to remove what she claimed were excessive bird feeders, arguing they attracted too many pigeons. Eleanor confided, "I've been waiting for someone to stand up to her." Her support, along with that of several others, helped solidify a growing sense of unity in the neighborhood. Emboldened by the support, Dylan began collecting evidence to expose Melissa for the bully she truly was, a tyrant hiding behind a facade of authority. As word of her outrageous behavior spread throughout the neighborhood, what had once been whispered complaints grew into open discussions about her overreach. It all started with Robert, the gadget-loving retired engineer next door, who revealed that he had long been documenting Melissa's antics with a collection of security cameras and drones. "I've got footage of her measuring lawns at the crack of dawn," he said one afternoon, showing Dylan clips of Melissa sneaking onto properties with her ever-present tape measure. Then there was Olivia, a single mother from a nearby house, who shared her own horror story. "She once called animal control on my puppy for barking excessively," Olivia recalled, shaking her head. "It was a 3-month-old Labrador. He barely made a sound." Her story resonated with many, further weakening Melissa's grip on the community. Even Eleanor, whose calm and steady presence had long been a source of comfort in the neighborhood, began to share her own encounters with Melissa's arbitrary enforcement of rules. With Dylan leading the charge, the neighbors started to subtly but effectively push back. Robert established a group chat, humorously named Melissa Watch, where residents could swap updates, share anecdotes, and post memes highlighting Melissa's latest escapades. This virtual space became a wellspring of humor and solidarity, enabling the community to strategize and support one another. Casual backyard gatherings at Dylan's home became the highlight of the week, as neighbors swapped stories over drinks and food, gradually transforming the neighborhood's atmosphere from one of isolation to a tightly knit community united against petty tyranny. Not everyone, however, was eager to choose sides. Some residents, wary of Melissa's vindictive nature, opted to remain neutral, with one fence-sitter warning, "She'll find a way to get back at you." Others, still somewhat enchanted by her manipulative charm, hesitated to speak out. Dylan understood their reservations, knowing all too well the power that fear and intimidation could wield. Yet one unexpected neighbor, Ethan, a young man who had always appeared indifferent to neighborhood politics, approached Dylan with a stack of old HOA documents he had unearthed from his attic. "Melissa has been making up rules for years," Ethan explained, handing over the documents. "These bylaws prove that half of what she enforces isn't even real." Armed with this damning evidence, Dylan and his growing band of supporters began to craft a strategy to finally expose Melissa's true nature. Unaware of the mounting resistance, Melissa continued her crusade, her demands growing increasingly extreme and her public outbursts more theatrical. The final straw came when she attempted to enforce a mandatory mailbox alignment day, insisting that every resident adjust their mailboxes to her exact specifications. For many in the community, this was the last insult. The mounting pressure and micromanagement had finally pushed them over the edge. The once fractured neighborhood had coalesced into a united front, leaving Melissa increasingly isolated and powerless. Her downfall was ultimately precipitated by her own arrogance and relentless need for control. As she doubled down on her absurd enforcement campaigns, Dylan and his fellow neighbors quietly prepared for the ultimate confrontation. The situation reached its climax at one of Melissa's impromptu neighborhood meetings, an event she had organized without any official authority, where she demanded mandatory attendance to address what she called the deteriorating standards of our community. Dylan, along with Robert, Olivia, Eleanor, and several other residents, recognized that it was time to stand up to her. Melissa entered the meeting with all the pomp of a self-appointed monarch, clipboard and projector in hand, ready to launch into a tirade against Dylan's wildflower garden, the so-called noise disturbances from his gatherings, and even the alleged hazardous glare from his outdoor string lights. With dramatic flair, she warned, "If we don't act now, this neighborhood will descend into chaos." Calmly, Dylan waited for his moment. When Melissa opened the floor to comments, he rose and said, "Melissa, you've leveled numerous accusations against my property, but I believe it's time we address the truth about your so-called rules." The room fell silent as Dylan stepped to the front and placed a stack of documents on the table. "These are the original HOA bylaws," he announced, holding them up for all to see. Ethan discovered them hidden in his attic. "And guess what? Half of the rules you've been enforcing don't even exist." A ripple of gasps spread through the crowd as Dylan flipped to a highlighted page, pointing out that there was no regulation regarding mailbox alignment, no prohibition against wildflower gardens, and certainly no decibel limit for a dog's bark. Robert then played video footage on a projector. Clips showed Melissa trespassing onto Dylan's property to measure the grass, and another sequence revealed her peering into Olivia's yard to count the number of toys in her children's play area. The footage, combined with Melissa's exaggerated expressions and sneaky maneuvers, provoked laughter from the assembled neighbors. Desperate to regain control, Melissa stammered, "This is an attack on my character. I've always acted in the best interests of our community." But Dylan was not finished. "Is that so, Melissa? Because according to the city inspector, you even built a shed on communal property without proper approval. How ironic, given your insistence on strict rules for everyone else." At that moment, Eleanor interjected while brandishing her phone, "And let's not forget the time you tried to have my bird feeders removed because you claimed they were against policy, when in fact, nothing in the bylaws mentions bird feeders." One by one, other neighbors shared their stories of Melissa's baseless complaints and petty demands. The turning point came unexpectedly when a local police officer, who had long grown weary of Melissa's false 911 calls, stepped forward at the meeting. "Melissa, we need to speak with you," he announced. "You have been misusing emergency services with your constant false reports. This is a formal warning. Any further false calls and you will face legal consequences." Now red-faced and trembling, Melissa slowly realized that she had lost control of the narrative. Her once loyal supporters had abandoned her, and the entire neighborhood was united in exposing her hypocrisy. Storming out of the meeting while muttering about ingratitude, she left behind a community that had reclaimed its voice. The very next day, the changes were unmistakable. Melissa's meticulously maintained lawn was now conspicuously overgrown. Her mailbox stood askew, and a forlorn "for sale" sign in her yard seemed to signal her retreat. Dylan watched from his porch as a moving truck whisked her belongings away, and he couldn't resist placing one final lawn gnome at the edge of his property. A small, smug figure holding a sign that read, "By Melissa." That evening, neighbors gathered for a celebratory barbecue, toasting their newly restored freedom and the sense of camaraderie that had emerged from the chaos. Melissa's downfall was not merely a personal victory for Dylan, it was a triumph for the entire community. With her departure, the neighborhood transformed entirely. The tension that had long hung in the air was replaced by laughter, friendly conversations, and a genuine sense of unity. Although the ordeal had been exhausting for Dylan, it had also proven immensely rewarding. He had moved to the neighborhood expecting isolation, but ended up gaining a vibrant community. The morning after Melissa's exit, Dylan stood on his porch, sipping his coffee as he admired his wildflower garden in full bloom, accompanied by the gentle hum of bees. It was the first time he could truly enjoy his home without the looming presence of Melissa. Eleanor soon ambled over, carrying a fresh batch of cookies. "I made these to celebrate," she said with a sly smile. "You did what no one else could, Dylan. You stood up to her." Laughing, Dylan accepted a cookie and offered her a seat, replying, "It wasn't just me, it was a collective effort." That evening's neighborhood barbecue became the largest gathering anyone could recall. Families shared food, children played games, and even the more reserved residents emerged to celebrate the freedom of a Melissa-free zone. Robert, ever the jokester, set up a projector to display a montage of Melissa's most ridiculous moments, complete with humorous commentary from the Melissa Watch chat. The entire crowd erupted in laughter when footage of Melissa measuring Dylan's grass played on the screen. Olivia raised her glass of lemonade, its golden hue reflecting the setting sun, and toasted, "Here's to Dylan for standing up to Melissa and uniting us all." Amid cheers, Dylan, though a bit embarrassed, smiled and raised his own glass. He had never sought to be a neighborhood hero, yet circumstances had made him one. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood blossomed with newfound freedom. Without Melissa's oppressive interference, residents felt liberated to express themselves. Halloween decorations grew more extravagant, gardens blossomed in riotous colors, and the once quiet cul-de-sac buzzed with life. Local police officers, now tired of Melissa's baseless calls, even stopped by occasionally just to enjoy the peaceful ambiance. Dylan, increasingly drawn into the community, found his backyard transformed into the go-to spot for gatherings. His once solitary mornings were now frequently interrupted by friendly neighbors stopping by for a chat. He even co-founded a small gardening club with Eleanor, much to the hypothetical chagrin of a far-removed Melissa. The sweetest closure came a month later when a letter arrived in Dylan's mailbox from the city inspector. It contained a formal apology for the repeated investigations triggered by Melissa's unfounded complaints, along with a handwritten note that read, "Thank you for standing up to her. The whole city owes you one." Dylan chuckled as he pinned the note next to his old violation notices, a fitting reminder of how far the neighborhood had come. With Melissa's reign of terror finally over, the community was stronger, happier, and more united than ever. Stepping out onto his porch, Dylan looked over his wildflower garden, and the solitary lawn gnome at the edge, still proudly displaying its sign, seemed to echo his sentiments. "By Melissa." He raised his coffee cup in a mock toast to the quiet street, murmuring, "To peace and quiet," with a contented grin, finally ready to enjoy the home he had fought so hard to protect. If you found this tale as engaging and humorous as we did, please like and share it with anyone who's ever experienced their own version of neighborhood tyranny. Subscribe for more entertaining, heartfelt, and thought-provoking stories. Feel free to comment below with your favorite part of this narrative or share your own experiences with local authority overreach. Your support and stories help build our community of storytellers and truth tellers.